once again with another tech vid. Today I'm going to be talking about a maintenance that is specific to dual suspension mountain bikes, and that is going to be the maintenance for our pivot points on our rear swing arm, our rear suspension setup basically. So first off, this is again, like I said, this is something that's unique to dual suspensions, just because, I mean, a hardtail or a road bike, they're not going to have these pivot points. When you want to do this, I tend to do it at least once a year. Also, if ever you see that there's any loose in your pivot points, I'll always take them apart, grease them, put them back together, make sure the loose is gone once it's properly torqued. What you're going to see in terms of the difference between cleaning and replacing is if it is properly torqued and there's still a little bit of play in, that means that it's worn out. Again, if you take it apart and you see that your parts are rusted, you're going to want to replace them as well. And on that note, we're also going to have two different types of systems for our pivot points. We're going to have bushings versus bearings. Basically, the difference between those two is a bushing. There is no roller bearing. There's no ball bearing component to it. It's basically just two cylinders together, grease. That's going to reduce the friction, so you have a little pivot there. You'll have other times where it's going to be an actual bearing. Most of the time we're going to see sealed bearing, similar to what we'll have in press fit wheels or headsets these days. For the bearing type, I mean, it's the type of thing, I won't take it out unless I'm going to replace it. So I'll take everything apart, I'll clean the bearing on side, but I tend to not like to take my bearings out unless I'm planning on putting new ones in. Just because unless you've got a really good bearing extractor, a lot of times you're going to do a little bit of damage to that bearing taking it out, especially if you're using the classic technique of hammer and a punch. That if ever you're hitting on a bearing like that, you definitely want to replace it afterwards. And I'm also not a huge fan of taking the bearings apart, taking the dust caps off to grease the inside, just because generally speaking you're going to have a real difficult time not doing any damage to that dust cap when you're taking it on or taking it off. So you're essentially just going to make it easier for dust to get in afterwards. I mean, it's a sealed system, it's designed to work like that, so I tend to try to leave it together. Alright, so next step, I'll give you guys a little rundown of what you're going to need for a job like this. First things, you're going to need either Allen keys or Torx bits. In my instance, I've got a few different size Torx bits here, from a T25, T30, T40, all the way up to a big old T55. So I've got all these set aside for me. A little wrench, I like to use my little socket wrench like that. Torque wrench for when we're putting it back together is super important for a job like this. You definitely want them to be properly tightened. Too loose, you're going to have to play, it's going to wear out quickly. It could actually end up getting to the point where it's dangerous. Too tight, well, I mean, then you could strip your parts as you're installing them type thing, and we want to avoid all that, right? So torque wrench, definitely key for a job like this. And we're also going to need our bearing grease. So again, this is a type of grease that's used for bearings. I use it anytime I've got moving parts, compared to, let's say, like your basic assembly grease, which is the type of thing that you'll put on, let's say, your seat stem and what. It's not a moving part, so it's just an assembly grease that's going to let us take it apart if need be, so that it doesn't seize. Bearing grease for moving parts that are going to be in movement. It's highly lubricative, lasts a long time, good stuff. And we're going to need some rags. So I've got a dirty one and a little clean one here. And you might want to use some cleaning products, but I mean, most of the time I find for parts like this, I can get away with just using a rag to wipe it down, because usually there's not a whole lot of grime that's going to build up. It's just going to be the grease that you put in last time you did the maintenance, or the last time the maintenance was done. Alright, so next I'll get started on the demo. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you on one of the pivot points here. So I'm going to take just this one out of hazard. Not really a real reason for that, I mean, just a good example. This one I've got on one side, I've got a T30, on the other side I've got a T25. So I'm going to go with my T30 first. See if I can break the torque. I'm going to need both of them here. Alright, so the torque broken now. Should be able to do the rest of this easily enough by hand. Oh, still need at least the other socket. there's my bolts. I'm just going to wipe the grease off that right away. Put it aside. And see, I disconnected already my rear shock here. That just means that I'm going to have an easier time moving my swing arm around since there's no resistance that's going to be given by the rear suspension. I'll just push that axle through. Screwdriver if I can. It is being a pain. Let me try something here. Let's see if I can't pull this out. That's what I'm looking for. Sometimes if it's being a bit of a pain like this, you can take this screw from the other side, screw it back in a little ways, the bolt I should say. So you want to get quite a few of the threads in so that it's going to have enough strength to withstand it. You get a few of those in, and then you can kind of pop it out like that. So now I'll pull my bolt back out, and I should be able to take the pivot shaft all the way out. Alright, so again, I'm just going to wipe my little bolt down here, put it aside. And let's see about getting this guy up now. It's still pretty stubborn. This is a little bit easier. Yeah, let me try something. Another trick if it's being stubborn like that is you can take an Allen key that's long enough and you can try to push it through as much as you can. This one is being very, very stubborn for me right now. Let's see. Still stuck. Well, never had quite this much difficulty. Alright, we're almost through. Hammer should not be your first resort, but if it's being real stubborn like this, sometimes it's what we need. Almost out. And there we go. So I'm going to take that cap off, put it aside. I'm going to wipe down my pivot shaft. And see, it's just a shaft like this. The bolt screws into the other end, and then it's going to be a bearing in this case on either side that's going to rotate on this. So again, I'm looking at my the color of my grease in here. It's still just about the same color as it was last time I put it in. So this is probably not going to need any bearing change. It's probably going to be set with just a good cleaning. I'll wipe that down. Take the caps off on the inside. Screwdriver for the other one. So these little caps, they're just in place. They're held on with the force of the pivot of the bolt from that compression. Sometimes you just need a screwdriver to pop them off a little bit. So they can have a little bit of suction with the grease that's on there. So just wipe those down. And if you're in an instance like this bike that I have here, I've got a cap on each side of this pivot point right here. On each side of my bearing, basically, there's a little cap. So you want to take a note of which one goes where. In my case, it's fairly easy. I've got one that's quite a bit larger than the other, and on the outside, it's also got the size of the torque wrench that I need and the force of my torque value, which is 5 Newton meters in this case. So it's pretty simple, but I still want to take a note of that just to make sure that I don't mix them up as I'm putting it back on. And wipe down everywhere, front and back. And I can tell that this bearing is even just how hard it was to get that shaft out. I'm not going to have to change these bearings. They're still in good shape. There's no rust. They look pretty close to brand new. Alright, I'll just give you a little close up of what it looks like here. So you can see I've got my little bearing that's pressed in there. Nice and clean, there's no rust or anything like that. I'm in good shape. You can see same thing for the one on the other side. Now what I want to do basically is I just want to re-grease and reassemble and then torque down. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to squeeze a little bit out of the tube and kind of rub it all the way around the bearing like so. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And I'm going to do the same thing on the inside of the bearings. And again, if you've watched some of my other videos, I like to mention that you're always better off to have a little bit extra grease than not enough. You can't really do any damage to your bike by having too much grease, essentially, is what it comes down to. I guess the one exception is that you don't want to put grease on your chain, you want to put chain oil. But for pivot points, for things like this, you can't really have an excess of grease on the bike. And basically what we're going to do is once we put everything back together, we're going to wipe the excess that squeezes out after the compression off anyways. The only thing, the worst part about putting more grease than you need is that you're just wasting a little bit. Alright, so first thing I want to put back through is the pivot axle, or the pivot shaft. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on that as well. Spread it around. And now I'm going to put my caps back. So I'll put the inside ones first. Like so. The other thing with these caps is that they are slightly conical. You want to just take a note of which side it was when you took it off, essentially, and try and put it back on the same way. But generally speaking, the flat side is going to be up against the bearing. So I'll just squeeze those in there. The grease should hold it into place. Then I want to take the cap that's going to be on the side of my bolt, and I'll put that right on the side of my pivot shaft, I should say. I'll slide that right on right away. Now I can line everything up and put this shaft back through. And thankfully it goes in much easier than it was coming out. So I'll take my rag right away and I'll wipe off some of this extra grease here on this side. Then I want to take my cap on the non-dry side. And since I have one of my caps for one side is going to have a smaller opening than the other one. Basically one side it's so that the whole pivot shaft can fit through. And then on the other side it's just an opening that's large enough for the bolt. So you can't really mix those two up. There's only one way that they can go through. And you can actually, in this case, I could put my drive shaft through on either side. Sometimes it's going to be directional. There's not really going to do any harm if I put it in from the other side, but I try and keep them all on the same side just for basically aesthetics purpose and simplicity. So, grab my compression cap and put my bolt right through it. And I need my T25 Torx bit. And I'm just going to thread that back into place. Get it hand tight to start. And once I've got it hand tight, come back with my rag, wipe the excess grease off. And now I'm going to want to take my torque wrench and I'm going to want to tighten it down. And so this is where it's real important to see what your torque value is. For this one, all I have is 5 Newton meters, not a huge amount, so I can take my smaller torque wrench. And I'm going to go with my T30 on the torque wrench. And I'll set that up to 5 Newton meters. There we are. And I just want to tighten it down until I hear that nice little click of the torque wrench. I did a one last wipe of the rag. And then my next step would basically just be to repeat that process with each one of my pivot points. It's that simple. Alright, so to sum that up, basically what we did is we're just taking apart, re-greasing. Again, when we want to do this, I like to do it at least once a year, or if I see that, if I'm starting to seal loose in my swing arm, I'll definitely take it apart and check. Otherwise, it's basically a yearly maintenance type thing that I do. Super important, keep everything well lubricated, clean. Your parts are going to last longer. You'll end up spending less money in the long run, spending less time on doing more difficult jobs in the long run. Alright, thanks for watching. Have a good day.